Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Today, Renault F1 team have released their new 2017 Formula One Challenger, the R.S.17, seen with the covers removed for the first time in a very glamorous webcasted ceremony from London this morning. Here on this first shot, we get our first glimpses of the RS-17 with the covers removed, and I have to say, this is very quickly becoming the archetype of the 2017 Formula One car. First and foremost, from this shot, we get a nice overview of the car from slightly above and offset to vehicle left, but we can get a nice overview of the overall configuration, the front and rear wings, and of course the suspension and tires, those wide tires really popping on this car, probably due to the yellow and black coloring, which of course is an homage to Renault's historic livery, which they ran from the late 70s through the mid 80s in the first turbo era. Of course, Renault were the first team to bring turbo technology to Formula One with the RS1. I like how the RS17 paying homage to that nomenclature using RS in the car's name. On this first shot, of course, it is an overview of the car, but we can point out a few details already. The aerodynamic details on the car may be a little bit difficult to discern on these shots simply because we have large sections of black bodywork against a black backdrop, so some details may not quite stand out the way that they did on the Sauber, for example. However, we can see our front wing here. Just as Sauber have on their launch spec, we have a very complex front wing here on the Renault. And I'm a little perplexed at these launch wings because these cars are brand new, they have not turned a wheel yet on a circuit, and yet we have such advanced development already in the aerodynamics department. The wind tunnels and the CFD, that's the computational fluid dynamics that all the engineers are using due to the regulations on wind tunnel usage these days, I have to say the engineers must have been working overtime over the winter because we've got some great front wing designs already. Of course, all the front wings are going to have that slight delta profile, which is now mandated in the regulations, but if we look into the free sections of the wing where the real downforce is being generated, we see all of these flaps. I am counting 1, 2, 3, 4 flaps in the main plane of the wing, as well as several elements of cascade sections here. I'm seeing on each side 1, 2, 3, 4 cascade elements as well on the front wing of the RS-17. Incredible development right out of the box. I think the teams are all going to have this level of development on at least the front end, and certainly they're going to have a lot of variables to start playing with in Barcelona next week. Also, on the front section of the car, we can see the nose, another car that has that thumbnail appendage for a nose cone here. And a lot of people, including myself, were under the impression that this might disappear this year, but we now have two cars that we have seen in the flesh. I'm not counting the Williams FW40 because they have simply released a computer-generated image of it, but we have the Sauber and now the Renault using that thumbnail appendage on the front nose cone structure. We'll see about that. Next to either side of the nose cone, though, just like Sauber have done, Renault have the wing mounted on pylons, and those pylons are spaced out a little bit from the nose cone proper so that we have air being funneled underneath the car toward the center section where the T-tray is, and then the airflow, I'm assuming, is going to be able to split off partially into the radiator inlets and partially to feed the floor. Also on this shot, as we move a little bit of rears, we can see camera mounts on either side of the nose cone there. These are blanks that the FIA has homologated to allow the teams equity in terms of weight distribution and things like that, but also I do think that the teams are probably going to try and extract some aero benefit, marginal as it may be, from those camera mountings, and of course when cameras are mounted there, we're going to have some very dramatic views indeed. Slightly arrears of that, we have the front suspension. We see another conventional double wishbone and push rod suspension configuration on the Renault. This is probably going to be ubiquitous up and down the pit lane. I don't think anybody is going to try anything glorious or very risky with these unconventional pull rod layouts. We know Ferrari has experimented with that in the recent past, not with any real success, so I think we're going to see push rods up and down the grid. It's going to be ubiquitous. And of course we see those wider front tires by Pirelli mounted to the front axle, looking very nice here in launch spec. Moving on to the chassis proper, just where the R is in Renault as it is written and scrawls back to the cockpit, we see what looks to be a little bit of a duct. I'm not entirely sure if this is just a trick of light on this shot, but between the number 30 and the R in Renault, we see a depressed area in the chassis, and to me that looks like it could be an S duct. So if that is an S duct, we've got ourselves a very sophisticated front-end aero treatment already, even in launch spec. Looking to the cockpit, things look pretty pedestrian. And I have to say, they're not really trying too many things in the cockpit area that I can see. We have a very conventional and pretty much standardized now mirror placement. Those mirrors painted in bright yellow to match the rest of the centerline bodywork. Very nice. Moving outboard of the mirrors, we see some vortex generators on the tops of the side pods. We've also seen these on cars in the last couple of years, so certainly Renault are going to be experimenting with that. It looks like the most outboard element of those vortex generators, though, is attached to the turning vanes. And unlike on the Sauber, we see these turning vanes in a much more sophisticated guise here on the RS17. So obviously, this is going to be an area of development across the entire season up and down the grid. As with the Sauber, the turning vanes are offset quite a bit from the side pods proper, so we have a lot of room for air to be funneled and pressurized toward the rear end of the car. Very cool. Very, very cool indeed. On this next shot, we have a front three-quarter view of the car. Little bit harsher lighting here, and I think it's going to help us discern some more fine details. We can see the front wing end plate here with the Castrol branding, and we've got ourselves some very interesting flow modifiers on the end fence there, just blocking out the lower half of the C and almost the entirety of the letter A in Castrol. Obviously, they're concerned about wake turbulence from that front wing interfering with the flow around the front tire. So they're trying to just clean out that airflow as much as possible to reduce that turbulence as the tires will induce in the overall flow across the car. Those tires, yes, open wheel, open cockpit cars, I know, but having exposed wheels are just terrible for aerodynamics. So the teams for many years, of course, have been trying to deal with that problem in many creative ways. Also on this shot, we get a better view of the nose cone attach point and also the pickup points for the front suspension wishbones that we can see here on the left-hand side of the car. We can see where the suspension actually mounts to the chassis, and then it goes up with linkages to dampers, most likely mounted on top there. Interesting attach point here on the nose. It looks like the dampers may or may not extend a little bit beyond where we can see the shut line, where the panels join up on the nose cone section to the chassis proper. So we'll have to see the car with the nose cone removed, which I'm sure we will see at some point, to see just how those dampers are configured. But it looks like they're going for a very far forward mounting section area for those front dampers, and perhaps some center of gravity considerations being made in there. Moving rearward, we get a better look at the turning vanes, and you see they've got a very complex shape to them. They are not just these vertical vanes that go straight up and down like we saw on the Sauber. We're seeing a very curvaceous design here on those turning vanes, and surely this is to interact with the vortex generators that we see on top of the side pods, and we saw that in the previous shot. And also, just as they do on the Sauber, they're trying to scoop up some air from around the front section of the car and start to route it around the side pods and then to feed the floor. And on this next shot, we have our first true overhead view of the car with much harsher lighting. We're able to divine some more detail from this shot. Looking toward the front section of the car where we see Renault written across the chassis, yes, there is indeed a duct between here, number 27 on this car, and the Renault lettering there. There is a duct. I'm going to say that's an S duct. As Ferrari debuted on the F2008 back in 2008, the rationale of this duct is just to clean up the airflow and have some interaction between the flow underneath the car and the flow that goes over top of the car. This is to route air around the cockpit so that there's less turbulence, to move the driver's head around, perhaps remove a little bit of helmet lift that we see at high speeds, but also to clean up the airflow heading in toward the airbox. We haven't talked about the airbox yet on this car, but they've done some very interesting work there, dividing it up into, I counted, 4 chambers on some other shots that we're going to take a look at. So some interesting work going on aerodynamically in the engine department as well. On this shot predominantly, though, I want to talk about the rear. Contrast this to the Sauber C36 that we took a look at yesterday. You can see that the Renault is much more tightly packaged around the rear than the Sauber is. And Renault are very bullish about their chances this season. They have a 95% new engine, according to their own publications, and the engine, most importantly, has been designed specifically with the RS17 in mind. This means that for the first time, really since 2009-ish, Renault have an engine that is designed for their car. And Renault, of course, very bullish about this season. They are targeting 5th in the Constructors' Championship. That would be a huge improvement over their form in recent years, and of course they want to win races as soon as possible. Of course, all of this remains to be seen, but Renault is certainly very, very confident. They've brought Alain Prost onto the team as a special consultant, they're calling him. He says that his role is going to be more behind the scenes. I'd fully expect to see him at least some races this year, however. But again, that packaging around the rear end, you can see that traditional Coke bottle section. Of course, Ferrari on the 640 in 1989, they really started to play into that Coke bottle philosophy of making the rear end as narrow as possible, and I don't think we've seen any solution quite as extreme as the Williams FW31. But again, the packaging around the rear, very, very tight. That Renault engine must be very compact, and they're saying, according to the Renault spec sheets that they've released to the press, that the engine is putting out about 900 horsepower plus. So again, if they're willing to tell the general public that they're producing 900 horsepower, you better believe it is higher than that. So they are very optimistic about this season. So more details that I want to point out on the floor. We can see in front of the rear tires we have some not quite ducts, but there are some areas cut out in front of the front tires. This is probably, you can consider them mini turning vanes. They're trying to condition the airflow and turn it a bit as it is heading toward the rear section of the floor. They're probably looking to interact with the lower sections of the rear wing, and of course to interact with the lower A-arms wishbones on the rear suspension to create a little bit more, if not downforce, but some more stability in the flow, take out some more turbulence if it exists at this point. Also, of course, they're trying to turn the flow away from the rear tires, which are basically big aerodynamic speed brakes sitting there on the rear of the car straight in the airstream. So again, just trying to make sure those tires are sitting in at very least a zone of neutral pressure so that they don't add too much drag. Also here at the very rear, you can see the integration of the exhaust. We have a triple element exhaust, and we're going to have a better look at this in a couple of minutes, but 2 pipes, one each for the wastegates, and then the central pipe is for the turbine exhaust, which of course is integrating the exhaust flow from each of the engine's 6 cylinders. Very cool shot. On the front end, you can see that delta profile of the front wing, again homologated for this year. Because we've pulled out a little bit, we can't divine too much more detail on the front wing from what we've already seen, but you can see the overall plan of the car, particularly in the geometry of the front suspension. I like that. Things are very smooth and very clean, and you can see some barge board activity going on. Much smaller barge boards than Sauber are running, and they're running in a completely different profile. However, this is a launch spec car. Things will probably vary significantly between what we see here and what we see in the first test, much less the Australian Grand Prix. And on this next shot, we have a profile view, and here, this is a very dramatic shot for me because you can see that already in launch spec, they are running this car with an extremely aggressive amount of rake. Just to recap, rake is the angle of pitch, nose to tail, relative to each other that a car has at rest. So you can see the ride height on the front is significantly lower than it is on the rear. Again, they may be having some trickery going on here in terms of the background and the shadowing, but that looks to be a substantial amount of rake to me, and Red Bull, of course, ran a lot of rake on their cars when they were winning world championships. So clearly there is a lot of work being done on this car to make sure its center of gravity is exactly in the middle, and aerodynamically they want to supplement that by putting a lot of rake into the car. This is probably going to make the car a little bit pointy, we call it, when the front axle is very responsive and has a lot of initial bite on turn in. Coupled with these larger slick tires this year, I think this car is going to have a lot of cornering grip, and it certainly looks that way just standing still here in launch spec. Also, the other major detail that I'd like to point out on this shot, we have another shark fin. The R.S.17, just like the Sauber C36, we're running a shark fin. This is a very aggressively styled one. You can see it comes to a very sharp point at its tip, at its extreme rear section, and then it cuts in again to accommodate the support strut and hydraulic strut for the rear wing and the DRS actuator assembly there. Aside from that, you can see the cockpit surround, of course, homologated for the driver head protection, and you can see a little French flag just underneath the extreme forward section of the air snorkel next to the Infinity logo. Very nice, a little bit of national pride. I certainly like that. In this light as well, you can see just how nice this livery really is. Of course, you've got the predominant colors of black and gold, but also I like how they have placed all of the sponsorship graphics. The car looks very clean, very nice, and very fast, even just standing still. I don't know about you, but I think I am feeling a little bit optimistic already about the chances Renault may have for glory this year. And on this shot, we have these pictures taken at the launch ceremony today. So these are taken in the flesh, the actual car sitting there in front of the camera lens. And here we have some detail that we can make out on the rear wing. Just like Sauber have done, Renault have cut some gills into the top section of the rear wing end fence. Again, just to control the high pressure air that's coming across that wing and to keep it from going into a high angle of attack stall, much like you would get on an aircraft that is pitched up too quickly. So that's what those gills are for, just to help some air spill out over the sides. Also, we see in the midsection of the wing, we see some profiling work going on. This is not a flat end plate by any means, and we have some strakes. I can't quite tell if they are slots that are cut into the side of the wing or if they are just almost stick-on flow modifiers along the side there, cutting across the Microsoft Dynamics logo there. On the extreme lower side of the wing, you can see more gills, more striations cut into it, again just to control some airflow around the lower section of the wing and to interact a little bit with the probably turbulent air that's going to start coming off of the rear of the car in the floor and top section of the diffuser area. Also here, interacting with the shark fin, you can see the line of the bodywork proper, the back side of the snorkel, very nice continuously curving line there. I like this open curving shape, very similar to what we've seen on the Sauber. Again, the cars are all going to be relatively similar in terms of their wheelbases and overall chassis dimensions because there's still no refueling allowed, so you need to make sure that you've got enough room for the fuel tank. That's going to necessitate a larger and longer wheelbase. Also on this shot, we can see around the forward edge of the side pod. First of all, you can see how nicely that side pod inlet has been sculpted. It tucks in to itself very nicely and leaves a lot of open space on the floor. The reference plane area is what I'm talking about here, for air to funnel in and be turned around using many, many aerodynamic effects, namely the Coanda effect, it looks like, because it looks, by the dimensions and configuration of that side pod, that they're trying to get the airflow to attach itself once it interacts with the barge boards, to attach itself to the side of the side pod and then funnel toward the floor area and the top side of the diffuser. So I'm certainly liking that an awful lot. Speaking of the barge boards, you can see a little bit more detail of the barge board structure. Again, they look to be smaller barge boards than what we've seen on the Sauber, but look at the complexity along the front edge of the floor there, just forward of the side pod and inboard slightly of the turning vane with the number 30 on it. You can see that there are no flat surfaces whatsoever in that area. Continuous curves, and of course, a lot of very sophisticated wind tunnel and CFD work has gone into designing this. Remains to be seen if it gives them any performance benefit, but in my experience watching this, cars that tend to look good to the eye also look good to the air. So I think, once again, Renault perhaps have found something here that will be of great interest to all of us. And now we get into the really meaty shots. This is the first full-on rear shot of a 2017 Formula One car that we have seen. Yes, we can see the diffuser for the first time. These are larger diffusers, much larger than we have seen in previous years, but again, they are still, by the looks of it, single deckers, so single planes generating the flow and expanding that flow from underneath the car, allowing it to expand outward. And of course, when air expands and slows down, you get a change in pressure, and of course that yields downforce. So you can see the diffuser design going on here. We've got these vertical strakes coming down from the top of the floor, moving down toward the road surface, and this is just to clean up the airflow, to take any turbulence away from it, because the air has already been worked significantly by the time it reaches this section of the car. So just to streamline that airflow and accelerate it out the back as the bodywork starts to pitch up relative to the ground. Also, we have a nice detail of the rear crash structure. Very substantial structure this is. Of course, this is basically homologated in the regulations. It has to be able to absorb the energy of a Formula One car smashing into it at top speed to protect the driver, and of course also to protect marshals and spectators alike. So we see the rear crash structure there, a very meaty, substantial structure. Also in this shot, we can start to peek underneath the bodywork, and we can see that there is an actual engine installed in this car. It does not look like they have used an engine blank, which is basically just a steel box frame that they use, because remembering the engine is a stressed member in the construction, the car will not hold together if an engine or an engine analog is not installed, but it looks like that they have put an actual engine in there because we can see some control lines and things going into it. And of course, we have our exhaust, that triple exhaust that we talked about before. The two smaller pipes are for the turbo wastegates, and the main pipe is the actual turbine exhaust, integrating the exhaust from the engine itself. Of course, the engine exhaust routed into the turbo to spin it up and generate boost pressure. Also from this angle, we can see a better shot of the rear wing. You can see the main plane of the rear wing. Similar to the Sauber, we have that depression in the middle of the flap. This is definitely to accommodate that DRS linkage going back to the actuator in the vertical strut that you can see just starting from above the central exhaust and then going up behind, from our vantage point, the main plane of the rear wing to actuate that flap up and down. Also, we can see a better profile shot of the geometry of the rear wing end plates. You can see that they are not flat by any means. They're flat on top, and then they curve sharply inward, and then they level out again with a slight twist to outboard. The outboard direction, screen left if we're looking at the left side pod, in that direction there, just to control the flow coming off of the top side bodywork. It also looks like we have some multi-layered rear brake ducts. These are ancillary wing components just to add a little bit more downforce on the wheels themselves. We've seen teams run these in the past, and certainly Renault are continuing in that tradition. And on this shot, we remain on the rear, but we change our angle slightly and get a little bit closer. You can get a better view of the exhaust now. Not a very important aerodynamic detail, but it still looks pretty cool nonetheless. And again, on this shot, we can see pretty much all the same detail that we saw in the previous one. You can see the rear suspension a little bit more clearly here, though. It's a very conventional layout again. Looks to be push rod and, of course, double wishbone. Also, we get a little bit better shot of the slot gap on the rear wing here. This, of course, is essentially infinitely adjustable as far as car setup goes, but you can see the slot gap here, which of course will open up substantially when DRS is engaged. And on this shot, we can see the rear zone of the car again, this time from the side. Coming in from the top of the screen left, we have the shark fin terminating in that very sharp point before it curves back in on itself to accommodate the strut for mounting the rear wing and accommodating the DRS actuator with the hydraulic lines that are running up to that section. Otherwise, we can see the suspension pickup points for the rear suspension. See it going into the chassis there. Again, substantiating my theory that they do have an engine mounted in this car. We see just above the lower wishbone there on the rear suspension to the left of the rear tire, you can see one of those temperature sensitive stickers that they'll use to monitor peak temperatures in the engine bay area. So I would say this car is more or less already in running spec, and they're just waiting for Barcelona to hit the track. Very cool. Along the extreme bottom of the frame, we can see some of that detail along the rear section of the floor. I talked about those corrugations that were cut into the tire squirt area, that area immediately in front of the front tire. We can see a little bit more of that geometry playing out in that section. Also, I want to point out the metallic looking sections that are immediately in front of the rear tires. It looks like these sections would be easily removable, and I'm not sure if this is just something to clean up that area just in launch spec, or if they're looking to do some more development of that particular section of the floor in testing, and they're just basically blanking off these sections for now. Again, the teams sometimes try to hide things from us simply because they don't want prying eyes looking where they shouldn't, so we'll watch this area for development. And on our last shot of the rear, I'm absolutely loving the fact that they allowed photographers to get up really close to this car, because we're getting some great shots of this thing already in launch spec. Along the edge of the floor here, on the bottom of the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the geometries there of those corrugations. They are not ducts, they are not holes in the floor, because holes in the floor, particularly in this area, are prohibited in the regulations, but you can definitely tell that they're looking to control the turbulent flow that may be arising increasing as the air interacts with the side pod. Moreover, you can see a little vein sticking up just to the left of the rear tire just to control that flow around the tire itself, and you can see the top section of the floor and the top section of the diffuser there. It very steeply ramps upward in an upward direction there just to help accelerate that air up and out through the rear wing and then out back to the atmosphere, thus increasing downforce significantly. Additionally, I'm not sure if this is a trick of the light or if this is an actual device on the car, but you can see on the prop shaft, at least it looks to be the prop shaft, you can see what may or may not be some sort of winglet. Again, there's a shadow falling on it, so I'm not sure if my eyes are playing tricks on me or if this is an actual winglet, but it looks to me that the prop shafts, the drive shafts, in other words, the appendages coming out from the differential and providing torque to the rear axle, it looks to me that that may be shrouded in some sort of aero device, and they're looking to generate a little bit more downforce, or at very least to calm the airflow through the rear section of the car using that area. So, interesting little development there, and again, we're going to keep our eyes on it. So, all in all, that is what we see on the RS17, again launched today by Renault Formula One team. So far, it is the most interesting car, technically, that we've seen of the 2017 fleet. Again, we've only seen the Williams, Sauber, and now the Renault, and we haven't even seen the Williams in the flesh yet. So I am sure that we will continue to be wowed by the details on these cars, even in launch spec. But this one is particularly interesting to me because there are already so many areas of development that Renault are starting to exploit and starting to experiment with even before they've hit the track in Barcelona for the first preseason test. So I'm going to be watching this car and watching this team with great interest this year because my instincts are kicking in here and it's telling me that potentially this car has some real performance potential, some real chance of competing at the front. Renault, as I said before, are very bullish about their chances this year, which is very unusual for them, especially given their recent form, but this car looks good to me, and of course we know that these guys building and designing the chassis in Enston and then working on the powertrain at Viry-Châtillon in France, they are certainly capable of putting together a world championship contender. They won the drivers and constructors titles in 2005 and 2006, so these guys have that sort of pedigree. They have all of the resources of the Renault Automobile Company behind them. Certainly they have the corporate backing and the finances that go with that, so they are more than equipped to develop a car that can compete at the front of the grid. I think that's what they want to do this year, and who knows, the RS17 just may have that potential. We shall see. That's all I've got for you right now. We will continue to keep abreast of the new car launches as they come out, and of course I will let you know what I think of them, and do let me know what you think of them as well in the comments section, please and thank you. Until next time, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.